In the history of motorsport, there are machines that raced, machines that won, and machines that changed the game. But every now and then, there is something so radical, so ahead of its time, that it doesn't just compete, it threatens to rewrite the rulebook. And when that happens, the guardians of the sport often react the only way they can: by banning it. This is the story of the Lotus 56 turbine car, a machine without pistons, without a gearbox. A car powered not by a traditional engine, but by a jet turbine. Technology borrowed from helicopters. A car so advanced it scared the establishment. And a car that was silenced before it could truly show its potential. The late 1960s were a golden era of experimentation in motorsport. Formula One, sports cars, and IndyCar were testing the limits of what was possible. Aerodynamics were still in their infancy. Safety regulations were minimal. And engineers had the freedom to push boundaries that today would never make it past a design sketch. At the Indianapolis 500, one of the world's greatest races, the stakes were higher than ever. American teams dominated with Offenhauser engines and classic V8s. The formula seemed set in stone. Big displacement, mechanical simplicity, and raw horsepower. But then came an idea that would challenge everything. What if you could replace the entire concept of a piston-driven engine with something smoother, lighter, and more powerful? The turbine engine wasn't science fiction. By the 1960s, turbines were already powering military jets and helicopters. The advantages were obvious: fewer moving parts, incredible reliability, and massive power for their size. Andy Granatelli, the flamboyant head of STP Racing, saw the potential. In 1967, his team entered the Indianapolis 500 with the STP Paxton turbo car, a four-wheel drive machine powered by a Pratt & Whitney turbine. Against all odds, it nearly won. With Parnelli Jones at the wheel, the turbo car dominated 171 of the 200 laps before a transmission bearing failed just minutes from victory. The establishment was shaken. A turbine had almost conquered Indy, and Colin Chapman, the visionary behind Team Lotus, was watching very closely. Chapman, known for his genius and ruthlessness, partnered with Granatelli and Pratt & Whitney to build a new machine for 1968. The result was the Lotus 56. This was not a modification of an old car. It was a complete reinvention. The 56 featured a wedge-shaped chassis for aerodynamic efficiency, all-wheel drive for stability, and at its core, the Pratt & Whitney ST6 turbine engine. Originally designed for helicopters, it produced over 500 horsepower with a weight advantage compared to traditional piston engines. The turbine's biggest strength? Seamless power delivery. No gears, no torque curve, just an endless surge of acceleration. Drivers described it as eerie, smooth, almost unnatural. When the Lotus 56 arrived at Indianapolis in 1968, it looked and sounded like nothing else. Instead of the rumbling growl of V8s, it emitted a high-pitched whistle, like a jet taxiing on a runway. Fans didn't know what to think. 4 Lotus 56 entered the race. Graham Hill, Joe Leonard, Mike Spence, and Art Pollard were set to pilot them. Tragedy struck early when Mike Spence was killed during practice. Despite the loss, the team pressed on. In qualifying, the cars showed incredible speed. During the race itself, Leonard and Pollard ran up front, with Leonard even leading in the final stages. With just 9 laps to go, the unthinkable happened. A small fuel pump shaft failed. The turbine car coasted to a stop, ending its dream of victory. It hadn't won, but it had terrified the establishment. The truth was simple. The turbine car wasn't unbeatable, but it had the potential to dominate once refined. It was lighter. It required less maintenance. It consumed fuel differently. And most importantly, it broke every assumption about what a race engine should be. The traditional teams were scared. They had invested millions in piston engines, gearboxes, and conventional engineering. If the turbine succeeded, all of that would be obsolete. It wasn't just a car. It was a revolution that could erase decades of development. The governing body of IndyCar, USAC, reacted swiftly. They introduced new restrictions for turbine cars, limits on intake size, stricter fuel rules, and regulations that strangled the turbine's advantage. By 1969, the turbine was effectively legislated out of existence. Colin Chapman was furious. He had poured resources into a car that represented the future, but politics and fear had killed it before it could prove itself. Lotus, already stretched thin between Formula One and IndyCar, shifted focus back to conventional designs. The turbine became a museum piece, a relic of what might have been. For Chapman, it was one of the rare times his brilliance was stopped not by failure, but by regulation. To truly understand why the turbine was banned, you have to understand its unique qualities. Power curve. Unlike piston engines, turbines delivered smooth power across the entire rev range. Weight. With fewer moving parts, they were lighter and more compact. Reliability. Fewer pistons, rods, or valves meant fewer chances of catastrophic failure. Innovation factor. The turbine represented a future where engines could be simpler, more efficient, and radically different. But all of those advantages scared the establishment. Motorsport thrives on innovation, but it also fears disruption. The Lotus 56 never won the Indy 500, but its presence forced the racing world to confront a question. How much innovation is too much? By banning the turbine, USAC preserved the status quo, but they also robbed fans of a new chapter in racing history. Imagine if turbines had been allowed to evolve. Would today's cars sound like jet engines? Would reliability be leaps ahead? Instead, the turbine was silenced, forever remembered as a threat too great to be allowed. What if Joe Leonard's car hadn't broken down in 1968? What if, with just 9 laps to go, the turbine had roared across the finish line and taken the greatest prize in American motorsport? Would the rule makers have dared to ban it then, knowing the world had just witnessed a new kind of victory? Or would they have been forced to accept that the age of pistons and gearboxes was over, and that the future of racing would sound not like thunder, but like the high-pitched whine of a jet turbine? We'll never know. But the question lingers, echoing through the decades like the ghostly sound of the Lotus 56 turbine spooling up. Fans and historians still debate whether the turbine car was ever a fair competitor. Some argue it bent the rules beyond recognition, a loophole too dangerous to leave open. Others insist it was pure innovation, the natural evolution of racing, unfairly smothered before it had a chance to prove itself. Was it an unstoppable force that had to be stopped, or was it the victim of fear and protectionism? The truth lies somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that the Lotus 56 remains one of the most iconic banned machines in the history of motorsport. Not because it failed, on the contrary, it was fast, reliable, and revolutionary, but because it was never truly allowed to succeed. It represents both the courage of those willing to break boundaries and the insecurity of those desperate to preserve the status quo. In the end, the turbine car became more than just a machine. It became a symbol, a reminder that motorsport is not only a test of speed, skill, and engineering brilliance, but also of politics, power, and the invisible hands that decide what belongs on the track and what doesn't. When we look back at the Lotus 56 today, sitting silently in museums, covered in the soft glow of spotlights instead of the dust of Indianapolis, we see not a failure, but a missed opportunity. A glimpse into an alternate history where racing might have taken a radically different path. A history where the sound of jet turbines might have become the heartbeat of motorsport, but instead it remains a what if, a ghost of innovation, silenced not by mechanical weakness, but by human decision. And perhaps that's why the story of the Lotus 56 continues to fascinate. It reminds us that in racing, as in life, the greatest revolutions are often not lost on the track, but behind closed doors. The Lotus 56 turbine car was a machine so advanced it scared the establishment. It challenged the very definition of what a race car could be, and for that reason, it was silenced. Today, it rests in museums and collections. Its jet-like whine never to echo down the brickyard again. But its story still resonates because it asks the ultimate question. What if? Sometimes the most powerful engines aren't the ones that win races. They're the ones that force us to imagine a different future and then vanish before we ever get the answer.